The first whispers of the world's unraveling were so subtle that no one heard them. In bustling marketplaces, children ran between stalls, their laughter rising like smoke into the sky, and merchants called out their wares, their voices carried by the wind as if the earth itself celebrated ordinary life. Temples glimmered in the morning sun, their carved stones telling stories of gods and ancestors. From a distance, empires appeared eternal, their walls impregnable, their armies invincible, their kings confident in the permanence of their thrones. Yet beneath this veneer of vibrancy, the air carried a strange tension, a quiet forewarning that civilizations, even the greatest, are never immune to the inexorable pull of history. It is in these moments, when life moves with the illusion of continuity, that the seeds of silence begin to take root. In the fertile crescent of Mesopotamia, rivers that had once nourished fields and sustained cities began to show subtle signs of decline. Canals, once alive with the rhythm of trade and irrigation, slowed to a sluggish, uncertain trickle, while the soil along their banks hardened into cracks that whispered of future famine. Somewhere far to the north, the forests of the taiga rustled uneasily, and the distant hum of glaciers shifting seemed almost like a muted drumbeat warning of what was to come. The world did not tremble with fire or quake with sound. It moved with a hushed inevitability, as if the planet itself exhaled a sigh, preparing for the silence that would eventually drown human clamor. Across continents, similar tremors of quiet unrest traced invisible lines through human settlements. In the fertile valleys of the Indus, cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa flourished with the precise order of urban planning. But even here, subtle signs of instability began to emerge. Wells dried faster than the rains could refill them, and trade routes that once pulsed with exotic goods, carnelian beads, lapis lazuli, and fine textiles grew unpredictably silent. In the Americas, Mesoamerican civilizations like the Olmecs and their contemporaries maintained elaborate rituals to appease gods who demanded cyclical offerings. Yet the crops failed in ways that defied explanation, and the ceremonial plazas that once echoed with music and chants grew lonely under the relentless Sunday across the globe. Nature shifted imperceptibly. Small droughts, unremarkable at first, accumulated into persistent, insidious patterns. The world did not announce its coming death with storms or conflagrations. Instead, it whispered, leaving civilizations to continue their rhythms, blind to the approaching stillness. And it is in this quiet, almost tender prelude that humanity's hubris, its belief in permanence and control, would be most cruelly exposed. Amid this fragile calm, human societies continued their intricate dances of power and religion, unaware that the silence gathering outside their gates would soon rewrite the rules of survival. Kings and priests, architects and scribes pursued glory with a fervor, as if the world itself had promised eternal reward for their efforts. In Egypt, the early dynasties completed monumental tombs whose stones would long outlive their creators, while scribes meticulously recorded daily life and celestial phenomena with exquisite precision. Their hieroglyphs, etched into walls and papyrus, captured a world that believed itself immutable. Yet even as these grand gestures unfolded, subtle fractures appeared. Flooding along the Nile became irregular, the fertile silt that once nourished entire kingdoms waned, and the delicate balance between nature and civilization began to tremble. A similar pattern occurred in the vast plains of the Eurasian steppes, where nomadic tribes shifted with the seasons, responding to weather patterns that historians now recognize as early signs of ecological change. This was the world at the edge of silence, vibrant, confident, and unknowingly poised for a collapse that would spare neither the grandest cities nor the humblest village. The emotional weight of this quiet prelude cannot be overstated. Ordinary lives carried on against a backdrop of invisible tension. Farmers sowed seeds in soil whose fertility they could no longer take for granted. Mothers rocked infants beside hearth fires that flickered with uncertainty, and merchants counted coins in marketplaces whose shadows stretched longer each day. Across oceans and deserts, the same patterns played out, independent yet eerily synchronized. The Azores and Canary Islands, still largely untouched by human hands, felt the slow accumulation of climatic shifts. Winds changed direction, ocean currents slowed imperceptibly, and storms began to arrive at irregular intervals. Those few humans who might have sensed these alterations, fishermen noting changes in tides, shepherds observing subtle shifts in grazing lands, found their warnings dismissed by the larger machinery of human society. The world's first silence was not violent, but personal. A quiet dread seeping into the subconscious, unnoticed in the daily rhythms of life, yet powerful enough to shape destinies and decisions that would ripple across decades. In the cities, life continued with a deceptive brilliance. Artisans painted murals depicting gods smiling upon humanity. Dancers moved in patterned harmony during festivals, and the clinking of metal tools against stone seemed to celebrate the permanence of human achievement. Yet these sounds were the last echoes of civilizations that had not yet realized their mortality. Across Asia Minor, settlements along the Anatolian plateau faced an unusual sequence of harsh winters and dry summers, subtle enough to be considered anomalies at first, but persistent enough to unsettle the delicate balance of agriculture and trade. In distant China, the early dynasties recorded astronomical events with precision, yet failed to note the ominous correlations between climatic irregularities and societal stress. The world, vibrant and bustling, was gradually tuning itself to a frequency of quiet that would soon engulf all. These moments of unsuspecting daily life, so ordinary, so profoundly human, stand as a testament to the fragility of existence, a reminder that civilizations do not end with dramatic infernos, but often in the hushed stillness of inevitability. Yet, even in this hush, there were flickers of insight. Shamans, oracles, and sages across the world whispered of imbalance, of a world that spoke in signs rather than proclamations. In the highlands of Peru, early cultures interpreted strange weather patterns as omens. In Mesopotamia, priests scrutinized river levels and grain yields, attempting to divine messages from gods whose silence was deafening. These voices, marginal and often ignored, recognized the approaching shadow. They were the first chroniclers of an invisible apocalypse, scribes of a quiet annihilation that would not blaze in history books but leave only whispers and ruins. And while kings and commoners alike remained oblivious, the universe continued its subtle orchestration, preparing to fold the tapestry of human life into a silence so profound it would echo through millennia. By the time the first full signs of decay became undeniable, the world was already unprepared. Societies that had thrived for centuries, even millennia, faced the erosion of their foundations without spectacle or fanfare. It was not fire, nor invasion, nor plague that would annihilate them. It was the quiet collapse of systems long taken for granted. Water supplies dwindled imperceptibly. Trade routes faltered, and the soil itself seemed to mourn. The bustling streets and ornate temples that had once symbolized permanence now stood on the brink, their grandeur masking vulnerability. And so, history's first silent chapter closed not with a cry, but with a whisper, a prelude to a world that would not burn, but simply fall quiet, leaving the echoes of human ambition to drift among stone riverbeds and empty fields, waiting for someone, someday, to hear them again. The hearth is the heartbeat of civilization, and when it falters, the pulse of human life slows, then fades. Across the world, homes that had once radiated warmth, laughter, and the scent of simmering stews began to vanish. Not in flame or battle, not with the roar of armies or the crash of falling walls, but in a subtle, almost imperceptible retreat. Entire villages, once vibrant with song and commerce, fell silent as if the earth had swallowed them whole. In the lowlands of the Indus, mud brick houses crumbled into the soil, while canals that had carried water to gardens and streets turned into stagnant pools, leaving doorsteps empty and courtyards overrun by weeds. To a passerby, it was not violence that erased these settlements, but absence itself, a hollowing out of life so complete that even memory struggled to fill the void. Yet in these abandoned spaces, artifacts remained. Pottery half filled with ashes, tools left as if their owners might return at any moment, and tiny personal objects that whispered of lives interrupted. The quiet of these abandoned hearths became the loudest testimony of human vulnerability, louder than any trumpet of war. In Mesopotamia, cities that had once bristled with energy markets alive with the calls of merchants, temples echoing with chants of devotion, suddenly felt like ghost towns. Scholars have puzzled for centuries over the fate of these urban centers. Their disappearance marked not by conquest, but by a strange, creeping withdrawal of humanity itself. Streets grew empty, granaries sat untouched, and the canals that had been the lifeblood of civilization slowed to a trickle. Archaeologists now uncover these sites layer by layer, revealing a civilization paused mid-breath, clay tablets abandoned on desks, tools resting as if the hands that wielded them had evaporated. Across the Mediterranean, Bronze Age settlements vanished with similar quiet. In Crete and the Greek mainland, palaces and fortifications bore no signs of fiery conquest. Instead, they were deserted, their corridors echoing only the footsteps of time itself. These vanished hearths, spread across continents and cultures, suggest a pattern that transcended geography, a universal fragility of human occupation where life could be erased without spectacle. In the Americas, too, hearths went cold. In the arid valleys of the Andes, early cultures that once nurtured maize and quinoa, crafted intricate terraces, and built ceremonial centers, left behind structures devoid of sound. Pottery shards, obsidian blades, and woven fabrics buried beneath soil tell a story of sudden, inexplicable abandonment. Researchers speculate that climatic shifts unseen, slow-moving, and relentless undermined agriculture and water sources, compelling communities to leave their ancestral home. Yet the human imprint remained, frozen in frozen streets, silent plazas, and ceremonial staircases that once rang with ritual. It is a haunting image. A village emptied of its people but saturated with evidence of their past life. A reminder that absence itself can become a historical voice. The hearth, once the center of warmth and continuity, had been evacuated, leaving behind only shadows of memory. Even in remote regions where civilization seemed sparse, the disappearance of the hearth echoed across landscapes. Nomadic tribes of the Eurasian steppes left encampments without dismantling them, fires still smoldering, tools lying where they were last used. Evidence suggests that these movements were not violent, but compelled by forces beyond human comprehension: famine, drought, or slow shifts in ecological balance. The earth, once generous and predictable, had begun to withdraw its bounty. Communities reliant on precise seasonal patterns found themselves uprooted, wandering across grasslands that no longer supported life. Even when resettled, they carried the ghost of their former hearths with them. Stories of abandoned villages, ancestral grounds, and the silent monuments of the past that haunted memory like persistent echoes. The emotional toll of these vanished hearths rippled through generations. Survivors wandered landscapes scattered with the detritus of forgotten lives, carrying grief for ancestors whose homes were now mute. Oral traditions preserved fragments, names of towns swallowed by dust, families lost to famine, and shrines emptied of worshipper. In northern Africa, desertification claimed settlements once vibrant with trade along the Nile's periphery, leaving only the skeletal remains of buildings and the faintest traces of irrigation channels. Even the act of storytelling became an homage to the vanished hearths, a way to keep their memory alive in the absence of those who had once inhabited them. The silence was heavy, suffocating, yet strangely sacred, a pause that allowed future generations to reflect on the fragility of human continuity. Archaeological evidence reveals the mechanics behind this quiet vanishing. Studies of soil, pollen, and isotopic data indicate that prolonged droughts, declining fertility, and water shortages forced communities to abandon homes gradually, rather than abruptly. In some cases, cultural collapse preceded physical abandonment. Trade networks dissolved, political hierarchies failed, and social cohesion faltered before the last hearth went cold. Across the world, from the Indus Valley to the Mediterranean, and from Mesoamerica to Mesopotamia, the pattern repeats. Prosperity sustained by predictable environmental conditions gives way to an imperceptible, unrelenting withdrawal. In the historical record, this erasure is often mistaken for sudden catastrophe. But the true story lies in subtlety, the soft, almost imperceptible retreat of life itself, leaving behind empty houses, silent streets, and the spectral memory of human presence. Ultimately, the vanishing hearths are a testament to the quiet power of absence over time. They teach us that civilizations are not only threatened by external forces, but also by the slow erosion of environmental, social, and cultural foundation. When the hearths disappear, life does not end with dramatic explosions. It dwindles, lingers, and fades into the landscape. The world did not end in fire here. It ended in silence, in the hushed retreat of humanity from spaces it had once claimed as eternal. And in the remnants of these hearths, scattered across the globe, we glimpse the fragility of human ambition and the enduring echoes of lives that vanished quietly, leaving history to puzzle over their silent, haunting presence. Hunger is the quietest of disasters, creeping into homes and hearts long before its presence is acknowledged. It does not announce itself with trumpets or banners, nor does it march through streets with drums. It seeps into the soil, into rivers, into crops that wither unnoticed. Across the world, humanity began to experience this invisible predator, its shadow stretching over fields and granaries alike. In the Indus Valley, canals that had once nourished vast tracts of wheat and barley began to dry, their water trickling too slowly to sustain the people who depended on them. Crops failed in sequences that left no single culprit: drought, changing rainfall patterns, salinization, but always with the same outcome: famine. Villages emptied as families sought sustenance elsewhere, often discovering only desolate landscapes and abandoned hearths. In Mesopotamia, granaries that had stored decades of accumulated wealth became tombs for the hopes of future seasons. The careful balance between river, soil, and human toil had been disturbed, and the silence that followed was as lethal as any army. Across the Mediterranean, Minoan and Mycenaean civilizations felt the creeping gnaw of hunger as their agricultural systems faltered. Terraced hillsides, once lush with olive groves and vineyards, began to yield less with each passing season. The seas that had provided sustenance through trade and fishing could no longer guarantee the same bounty, as changing currents and overfishing compounded the threat of scarcity. Archaeological evidence reveals food storage pits left untouched, jars of grains abandoned mid-harvest, and skeletal remains that tell a story of malnutrition and slow decline. These societies, often remembered for their artistry and architectural grandeur, found themselves powerless against a force that spared neither palace nor peasant. Hunger spoke in shadows, leaving only traces of suffering and an eerie quiet where laughter, commerce, and ritual had once thrived. In the Americas, pre-Columbian cultures faced similar fates, though separated by oceans and thousands of miles. The inhabitants of the Andean highlands and Mesoamerican valleys relied on crops finely tuned to the rhythms of the sun, the rains, and the mountain soil. When these rhythms faltered through prolonged drought, soil depletion, or subtle climatic shifts, food became scarce. The result was migration, the abandonment of ceremonial centers, and the slow fracturing of communities. In the lowland forests of Mesoamerica, archaeologists have uncovered settlements where granaries were emptied but not looted, pottery left in disarray, and skeletons showing signs of chronic starvation. The pattern is unmistakable. Hunger did not strike in isolated pockets but moved like a silent predator across continents, leaving a world diminished yet outwardly unchanged. Even nomadic and semi-nomadic cultures, often thought immune to environmental stress, were not spared. In the Eurasian steppes, seasonal migration relied on predictable growth cycles of grasses for livestock. When rainfall patterns shifted and pastures withered, herders faced the impossible choice between survival and continuity. Entire clans wandered further than ever before, encountering increasingly harsh terrain, facing conflict with neighboring groups over dwindling resources, or succumbing silently to starvation. These movements, documented through archaeological surveys of ancient encampments, reveal a slow, inexorable pressure exerted by hunger, shaping migration patterns, social hierarchies, and even the rise and fall of nomadic confederations. Hunger, like a ghost, forced humans to adapt in ways that were invisible to outsiders, yet catastrophic to those living the reality. The emotional dimension of hunger is perhaps the most haunting. Families faced daily choices that tore at the fabric of society, leaving elders behind to seek food, rationing meager supplies, and witnessing children waste away despite desperate efforts. Oral histories, myths, and songs preserve fragments of these experiences, transformed into parables of caution, resilience, and despair. In regions like Northern Africa, where the Sahara's expansion gradually swallowed once fertile lands, stories speak of caravans seeking sustenance across deserts, of towns dying silently under relentless sun, and of hope eroding in parallel with each failed harvest. Hunger became more than a biological reality. It became a moral and emotional reckoning, revealing the fragility of human reliance on predictable cycles of nature. Archaeological evidence across continents shows a chilling consistency. Famine rarely strikes suddenly but intensifies gradually, eroding the social, economic, and cultural foundations of civilizations. In the Fertile Crescent, isotopic analysis of skeletal remains indicates malnutrition stretching across generations, weakening communities before societal collapse became inevitable. The same is true in the Indus Valley, Mesoamerica, and the Andes. Crops failed, water sources dwindled, and populations shrank quietly. Governments and rulers, so often remembered for their grandeur, found themselves powerless to intervene. The infrastructure of survival granaries, irrigation systems, trade networks was no match for the invisible hand of ecological change. Hunger whispered across the lands, a predator without eyes or teeth, yet devastating in its reach. By the time the toll of famine became undeniable, the world was already immersed in silence. Families fled villages that could no longer feed them, cities emptied as markets failed, and entire regions felt the ghostly absence of life. Hunger had done more than starve the body. It had stripped away vitality, undermined social cohesion, and silenced communities in ways that fire or war could not. The landscape was dotted with empty homes, skeletal remains, and the faint traces of once thriving civilizations. In every corner of the known world, hunger spoke in shadows, shaping human history through absence rather than confrontation. It was in these quiet tragedies that the world learned one of its most painful truths, that life, even in its grandest forms, can be erased not with spectacle, but with patient, unrelenting silence. Language is the pulse of memory, the rhythm of human thought, and the vessel through which civilizations speak to eternity. Yet as famine, drought, and slow ecological collapse reshaped the world, entire communities lost more than their homes or livelihoods. They lost their voices. Songs, prayers, oral histories, and rituals vanished alongside the people who carried them. In the Indus Valley, the enigmatic script of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro fell silent, never to be fully deciphered, leaving behind city plans and artifacts that whisper hints but speak no words. Temples once alive with chants and communal supplication became empty courtyards that had echoed with children's laughter and the fervent recitation of myths now absorbed only the wind. These silences were profound, the absence of communication stretching like a shadow over generations. When voices die, so too does the subtle thread that connects human experience across time, and the world found itself increasingly deaf to its own history. Across Mesopotamia, scribes labored over clay tablets with meticulous precision, recording laws, commerce, and the rhythms of celestial bodies. Yet the collapse of cities like Ur and Nippur left these scribes' efforts incomplete, buried, and ignored for millennia. Tablets lay in heaps, their ink dried and clay hardened, silent witnesses to a civilization that had lost its ability to narrate its own story. The communal stories that had guided social norms and preserved cultural memory evaporated alongside the very communities that told them. In Greece and Crete, oral tradition had long been a vessel of cultural continuity. Poems, epics, and sacred chants performed in public plazas, palaces, and theaters. But as famine and decline swept across regions, the storytellers dwindled. Their absence created a void that could not easily be filled. The songs and myths that had framed human understanding of gods, nature, and morality fell quiet, leaving only fragments preserved in later retellings, distorted by time and distance. In the Americas, the extinction of language mirrored the disappearance of communities. In Mesoamerica, early ceremonial centers were abandoned, and the ritual chants of priests, once resonant with the cycles of sun, moon, and rain, disappeared. Hieroglyphic records, carved into stone or painted on fragile materials, survived only partially, leaving modern scholars to reconstruct narratives from incomplete fragments. Similarly, in the Andean highlands, the intricate quipu strings of knotted cords used to convey numeric and narrative information became undecipherable as the communities that had maintained the knowledge dispersed or perished. The loss was not simply practical, it was existential. Knowledge embedded in language, agricultural techniques, medicinal practices, ethical guidance, historical memory evaporated alongside the speakers, leaving humanity poorer not only in numbers, but in wisdom. The silence was profound, resonating across valleys, plains, and riverbeds, like a mournful echo of human potential unrealized. Even in regions untouched by famine, the breakdown of social cohesion contributed to the extinction of voices. Nomadic groups scattered, seeking sustenance across diminishing pastures, leaving behind songs, stories, and communal rituals. Without continuity, language itself fragmented, mutating into dialects or disappearing entirely. In Africa, pastoralists migrating through arid lands abandoned settlements whose oral histories had mapped the landscape for generations. Rivers that once provided both water and a rhythm for cultural narratives ran low, and sacred sites fell into disuse. In these subtle, almost invisible ways, voices were extinguished not in sudden violence, but in the persistent erosion of human networks, in the slow disappearance of those entrusted with memory, and in the environmental pressures that dispersed communities far from their ancestral roots. The emotional weight of this silence is staggering. Humans, like all creatures, rely on communication not only for survival, but for identity. When voices vanish, the connection between generations fractures. Children grow up without the songs of their ancestors, without the prayers that had once framed understanding of the world, without the moral and social frameworks embedded in storytelling. Entire societies, when deprived of their narrative anchors, risk disorientation, vulnerability, and ultimately, dissolution. The anthropological record shows that communities with disrupted oral traditions struggle to maintain social cohesion under stress. Silence, in this sense, is not merely absence, it is a corrosive force, eroding memory, identity, and resilience, leaving humanity both physically and spiritually diminished. Even monumental inscriptions could not resist the creeping quiet. In Egypt, hieroglyphs carved on tombs and temple walls stood frozen, unable to speak for the dynasties whose rituals and prayers they once conveyed. Without the voices of priests, laborers, and worshippers, these symbols became mute, preserved only as historical artifacts, interpretable but devoid of the living resonance that once animated them. Similarly, in the mountains of Anatolia, reliefs depicting scenes of daily life, festivals, and military campaigns survived the depopulation of towns. But the chants, the oral instructions, and the shared experiences that had given them meaning were irretrievably lost. The more permanent the medium, the more poignant the absence. Stone endured, but sound did not. By the time the world had fully felt this silencing, entire civilizations were ghosts of their former selves. Communities had vanished, hearths gone cold, and nature's quiet reclamation was nearly complete. Without voice, humans lost the ability to articulate their collective experience, to pass on lessons, and to shape memory intentionally. The silence that hung over these civilizations was not just environmental or societal, it was existential. It left modern scholars, storytellers, and descendants piecing together lives and societies that spoke through shadows, artifacts, and the faintest remnants of once vibrant oral traditions. The extinction of voices, subtle yet total, became a defining signature of a world undone, not by fire, but by silence, leaving behind only whispers of what had once been. Even when humans vanished, their creations endured. Stone, bronze, and clay became the final witnesses of lives abruptly silenced, the last testament of civilizations that no longer spoke. Across the globe, monumental structures stood like quiet sentinels, defying time even as their creators disappeared. In Mesopotamia, ziggurats rose from plains now empty, their stairways leading to heavens no longer invoked by worshippers. These edifices, laboriously built with hands now dust, preserved the ambitions, beliefs, and artistry of people who would never return to them. Each stone, each carving was more than architecture, it was memory incarnate. Where voices and hearths had been extinguished, the silent architects left their signatures etched in enduring form, a dialogue between the dead and the living that transcended the absence imposed by famine, migration, or slow ecological collapse. In Egypt, pyramids and temples rose as eternal symbols of human aspiration. Pharaohs were entombed, not merely for the sake of burial, but for immortality, their resting places designed to speak across centuries. Hieroglyphs, murals, and statuary captured both the grandeur of daily life and the cosmic order imagined by their builders. And yet, while the structures endured, the communities that once animated them slowly faded into obscurity. Laborers, priests, and artisans, people whose sweat and devotion had brought these constructions to life, left behind only traces of their existence: pottery, tools, and scattered inscriptions. These remnants, though silent, resonate with a haunting beauty. They testify to the persistence of human creativity, even in the face of absence, revealing that the desire to leave a mark can outlast the individuals themselves, transforming impermanence into enduring witness. In the Americas, pre-Columbian civilizations carved their legacies into mountainsides, plazas, and ceremonial centers. The Olmecs shaped colossal stone heads whose eyes seemed to gaze across centuries, silent observers of lands emptied of their sculptors. In Mesoamerica, pyramids at Teotihuacan and ceremonial platforms in the Maya lowlands persisted long after urban centers were abandoned, their precise geometry and astronomical alignments reflecting sophisticated knowledge that survived the disappearance of the people who applied it. In the Andean highlands, terraced fields and stone pathways continue to define landscapes, a testament to agricultural genius that harmonized with ecology. Here too, the architects remained, not in flesh and voice, but in the physical imprint of their ingenuity, speaking in silent harmony with the earth they once cultivated and revered. Across Eurasia, the steppe cultures of the Bronze Age and early Iron Age left burial mounds, stone circles, and fortified settlements that endure as echoes of vanished societies. Kurgans and necropolises, though stripped by time and scavengers, continue to tell stories of social hierarchy, spiritual belief, and the rites that once bound communities together. Even without written records, the arrangement of stones, the choice of grave goods, and the orientation of structures offer a lexicon of meaning for those willing to listen. Archaeologists call these silent witnesses. Yet to the poetic mind, they are more than artifacts. They are the voices of the dead. Architects who communicate through geometry, material, and placement, offering insight into worlds extinguished long before history could fully capture them. The emotional resonance of these silent works cannot be overstated. They evoke awe, melancholy, and wonder simultaneously. Standing before a towering ziggurat, a ruined temple, or a colossal Olmec head, one confronts both human ambition and fragility. The structures whisper of societies capable of brilliance, yet vulnerable to forces beyond their control: climate, famine, disease, or slow environmental shifts. They compel reflection on the paradox of human existence, capable of creating monuments that outlast centuries, yet unable to preserve life in the face of quiet catastrophe. The grandeur of these works contrasts sharply with the vulnerability of the lives that produced them, underscoring the persistent tension between human aspiration and the impermanence of mortality. The distribution of these silent monuments also reveals the interconnectedness of vanished civilizations. Trade networks, shared architectural techniques, and cross-cultural influences emerge even where populations have disappeared. In the Mediterranean, Minoan, Mycenaean, and Anatolian structures reveal cultural diffusion and shared engineering knowledge. In the Americas, similarities in construction techniques among distant sites suggest networks of exchange and communication that persisted until environmental and societal pressures fragmented them. These monuments, in their silent testimony, map human ingenuity across continents, offering insight into lives and ideas that vanished, but whose echoes endure in stone, bronze, and clay. They are a cartography of absence, a geography of memory carved into the very earth. Yet, despite their permanence, these silent architects cannot speak for themselves. Without human life to interpret, celebrate, and maintain them, their meaning becomes partial, fragmented, and sometimes misunderstood. Archaeologists and historians labor to reconstruct their stories, but the full voice of the civilizations, the nuance of speech, the rhythm of daily life, the emotional cadence of rituals is lost. The monuments endure as both revelation and enigma, proof of human resilience, yet stark evidence of vulnerability to the quiet forces that extinguished hearths, voices, and communities. They remind us that even when humans vanish, their creative spirit lingers, speaking not in sound, but in enduring presence, a testament to what was, what remains, and what cannot be reclaimed. In the aftermath of vanished hearths, silent voices, and monumental legacies, the world became a landscape of echoes. Survivors wandered through abandoned settlements, overgrown fields, and collapsed temples, piecing together fragments of lives they barely remembered. Their memories were incomplete, filtered through grief, imagination, and the need to survive. In the Indus Valley, wandering groups stumbled across the remnants of cities' mud brick foundations, water channels choked with silt, and pottery inscribed with symbols they could no longer interpret. Each artifact was a whisper, a shadow of a life that had once thrived. Yet in the absence of clear narratives, these shadows often became myth, and myth gradually merged with history, blurring the line between reality and memory. Humanity, faced with its own erasure, began the slow task of reconstructing itself from fragments, guided by instinct, intuition, and the faint resonance of what had been. Across Mesopotamia, survivors and later generations interpreted the ruins of their ancestors with reverence, superstition, and fear. Ziggurats, once centers of daily worship, became landmarks of the past, mysterious and sacred. Travelers and settlers who followed found not bustling marketplaces, but stone and clay that whispered of devotion, trade, and social order, now extinguished. Stories circulated of vanished kings and priestly lineages, exaggerated and reshaped with each telling. The collapse of irrigation networks, granaries, and city walls was remembered as divine punishment or the consequence of human hubris, rather than the slow interplay of environmental and societal pressures. In these narratives, memory was both a compass and a shroud, a tool for survival and understanding, yet imperfect, fragmentary, and inevitably colored by the lens of those who remained. In the Americas, memory took on an almost spectral quality. Communities that survived climatic stress or famine wandered across valleys and mountains, encountering remnants of previous civilizations. Ceremonial plazas, unfinished pyramids, and terraced fields slowly being reclaimed by nature. These remnants were interpreted through oral traditions that combined observation with myth, transforming physical structures into sacred landscapes imbued with meaning beyond their original purpose. In the Andes, stories told of ancestors whose wisdom had been lost, whose rituals had been forgotten, and whose knowledge had become hidden in stones and terraces. Children grew up listening to tales of vanished cities, learning not only geography and history, but caution, reverence, and resilience. Memory, in this way, became a living inheritance, shaping identity even in the absence of continuous record. Even in Eurasia, the nomadic survivors of steppe cultures carried memories like fragile seeds. Tales of abandoned encampments, lost migrations, and extinct clans persisted in song and oral poetry. These stories were sometimes exaggerated, villages described as larger than life, battles imagined that may never have occurred, but they preserved the essence of vanished ways of life. Memory served as a map, guiding survivors across harsh landscapes, linking them to ancestors, and providing moral frameworks to sustain social cohesion. Where written records were absent, memory became both a compass and a chronicle, the only way to transmit accumulated wisdom, survival strategies, and cultural identity to future generations. Shadows of memory thus became tangible, shaping movement, settlement, and ritual across continents. The emotional weight of living among ruins and memories was profound. Survivors felt the haunting presence of lost neighbors, deceased relatives, and vanished friends. Children learned to distinguish between what had been and what had been imagined. Ceremonial practices became acts of remembrance, as much as acts of worship. People collected fragments, pots, tools, ornaments as talismans, reminders that life had existed here, that their ancestors had built, cultivated, loved, and mourned. The very act of remembering became sacred, a means of asserting existence against the erasure imposed by famine, environmental change, and social collapse. Shadows of memory were both painful and sustaining, carrying grief and hope in equal measure. In regions like Northern Africa and the Middle East, memory intertwined with survival. Ancient irrigation channels, now partly buried, guided the planting of new crops. Abandoned settlements offered shelter and material for rebuilding. Oral histories and legends, preserved by storytellers and elders, encoded ecological and social knowledge. By interpreting these shadows of memory, survivors could navigate a world transformed, mitigating the risks of famine, water scarcity, and social fragmentation. Memory thus became a tool of resilience, ensuring that lessons of the past were not entirely lost, even as civilizations faltered. The remnants of vanished peoples were not merely relics, they were living guides for those who remained. Yet memory was imperfect, subjective, and often incomplete. Entire languages, social structures, and technologies were irretrievably lost, leaving only partial glimpses of the world that had been. What survived was always filtered through the lens of those who lived after, reshaped by trauma, imagination, and the necessity of survival. Archaeology, oral traditions, and myth together became the scaffolding on which future generations reconstructed understanding, bridging silence with curiosity. The shadows of memory were thus both fragile and enduring, a testament to the human instinct to preserve identity and continuity even when civilization itself seemed to vanish. Through memory, the world continued to whisper of what had once existed, preparing the stage for renewal, reflection, and the eventual rebirth of knowledge that had once teetered on the brink of being lost forever. From the ashes of silence, life slowly reasserted itself. Though civilizations had vanished, hearths gone cold, voices extinguished, and memory fractured, the world continued to pulse with quiet resilience. Nature reclaimed abandoned cities, eroding walls and scattering artifacts. Yet in the very act of reclaiming, it preserved traces of human endeavor. Seeds carried by wind and water took root in old courtyards. Rivers carved new channels through ruins. Forests crept into plazas and streets. In this interplay of decay and regrowth, the world prepared a stage for rebirth. Humans, whether survivors wandering in search of sustenance or later generations stumbling upon relics, encountered these remnants and recognized in them both warning and inspiration. They learned to cultivate, innovate, and remember. The void left by vanished civilizations became a fertile ground for adaptation, imagination, and renewal. History, though scarred, was not extinguished. It waited, patient and persistent, for eyes ready to perceive its lessons. In Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley, new communities arose atop the shadows of old. Farmers reworked dried riverbeds and reclaimed fertile soil, learning from traces left by their ancestors. Granaries and irrigation channels were rebuilt, often mirroring older designs whose sophistication had endured across centuries. In the Americas, highland valleys and river basins saw the emergence of new cultural expressions built atop abandoned ceremonial centers, as knowledge encoded in terraces, canals, and structures informed agricultural practice and settlement planning. Even when languages had vanished, symbolic understanding and ritual structures persisted, transmitted through observation, mimicry, and oral memory. Humanity's rebirth was never a clean slate. It was layered, composite, and profoundly connected to the ghosts of the past. In every step forward, echoes of absence guided innovation and survival, revealing that silence, while destructive, was also instructive. Art, architecture, and ritual played a central role in this rebirth. Communities confronted by ruins and relics reinterpreted them in ways that bridged memory and imagination. Monumental structures inspired new designs. Pottery fragments influenced aesthetic choices. Even skeletal remains shaped myth and moral reasoning. Across Eurasia, Minoan, Mycenaean, and Anatolian ruins informed the architecture, urban planning, and ceremonial practices of later societies. In the Andes, terraces abandoned for centuries inspired subsequent generations to adapt and innovate agricultural strategies, integrating ancient knowledge with contemporary experience. The silent architects had left instructions not in words, but in form, technique, and logic. Humanity, attuned to these subtle guides, began to rebuild not only physical infrastructure, but cultural and social identity as well, proving that absence can educate as profoundly as presence. Philosophically, rebirth was also a negotiation with loss. Survivors and descendants faced ruins as reminders of impermanence, fragility, and the limits of human control. These encounters with emptiness fostered reflection, the realization that civilizations are not eternal, that power and wealth cannot guarantee survival, and that wisdom often lies in humility before nature and time. Across the globe, myths and oral traditions incorporated lessons from vanished societies, embedding practical knowledge about agriculture, water management, and social cohesion within moral and spiritual frameworks. The past became a silent teacher, its lessons written in ruins and memories rather than proclamations. Through this dialogue with absence, humanity learned to temper ambition with respect for the world, discovering a resilience born not of conquest, but of attunement and understanding. Emotionally, the rebirth was both tender and profound. Communities that had once been scattered by famine, silence, and ecological collapse found continuity in ritual, art, and memory. Children learned songs inspired by fragments of ancient chants. Farmers followed terraces built centuries earlier. Storytellers narrated myths rooted in vanished cities. Each act of remembrance, each adaptation, was a thread linking past and present, allowing new generations to inherit not just survival strategies, but identity, heritage, and hope. Even in landscapes that seemed devoid of life, human connection persisted. Silence had destroyed much, yet it had also clarified what was essential: community, memory, ingenuity, and the capacity to learn from both presence and absence. Globally, patterns of rebirth revealed the resilience of human ingenuity. Civilizations in Africa, Asia, the Americas, and Europe, despite environmental shifts and catastrophic decline, continually rediscovered, adapted, and innovated. Lessons hidden in ruins guided water management, agricultural strategies, and social organization. Knowledge once lost was partially recovered. Lost crafts were reinvented. Myths inspired ethical and practical frameworks for new societies. Humanity did not merely survive, it evolved, learning to read the subtle language of absence, to interpret shadows of memory, and to rebuild on the foundations left by silent architects. The quiet annihilation of the past became a scaffold for the creativity and resilience of the future. And so, in the culmination of this long, silent journey, a profound truth emerges. The world did not end in fire, nor did humanity vanish completely. Life persists in forms both subtle and extraordinary, shaped as much by absence as by presence. Monuments, memories, rituals, and fragments of language testify to civilizations that nearly disappeared, yet contributed to the tapestry of human continuity. The void once feared became a teacher. In every ruin, every silent hearth, every vanished voice, there remained the seed of rebirth, waiting for human curiosity, resilience, and reverence to awaken it. The story concludes not with despair, but with recognition that even in annihilation, the past endures, waiting for those who are willing to listen, to learn, and to create anew. Because the past is never truly gone, it's waiting to be reborn.